Well, in the new Trump era of disgraced Washington law firms that have shamed themselves forever by giving in to Donald Trump's plainly unconstitutional demands on them, there is tonight one Washington law firm that is taking the most boldly defiant possible course of action against Donald Trump. And I have never before considered using the word brave in relation to any high-powered, highly paid Washington law firm. The brave lawyers I've seen in our history have usually been sole practitioners outside of Washington, D.C., or members of much smaller law firms, sometimes little family law firms, taking on the most challenging cases. Gregory Peck won an Oscar for his portrayal of what became an iconic version of the brave lawyer. The Hollywood version of the brave lawyer has never been a highly paid member of a Washington law firm. Gregory Peck was on his own in To Kill a Mockingbird, the hero of that courtroom. But tonight, the two most important challenges to Donald Trump's reign of constitutional terrorism, what one federal judge has called lawlessness, are being represented by the same law firm. The Washington law firm of Quinn, Emanuel, Urquhart, and Sullivan is representing the man Donald Trump deported to El Salvador, to an El Salvador prison, in a process that even the Trump lawyers at first had to admit was, quote, an administrative error. And that same law firm is defending Harvard University against Donald Trump's flagrant display of constitutional dementia in his attempt to take over Harvard University and, in effect, make himself, Donald Trump, the president of Harvard University, in the same way that he took over the Kennedy Center, and control the admission of students at Harvard University, the hiring and firing of professors, and all of the hiring at the university, including the cafeteria staff, the coaches, the building maintenance staff, everyone. A letter addressed to the constitutional clowns working for Donald Trump, who demanded that Harvard University surrender to Donald Trump, was co-signed by William A. Burke of the firm Quinn, Emanuel, Urquhart, and Sullivan, representing Harvard University. That lawyer's letter told the small Trump team minds trying to take over Harvard, quote, the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. Neither Harvard nor any other private university can allow itself to be taken over by the federal government. Harvard is not prepared to agree to demands that go beyond the lawful authority of this or any administration. The entire phony, utterly phony pretext for Donald Trump's attempts to make himself the president of Harvard University is that Donald Trump is now the country's leading crusader against anti-Semitism. In one of his first trips to Iowa as a presidential candidate, Donald Trump felt compelled to try to make it very clear to Iowa voters right away that he was not Jewish. Donald Trump assumed that if Iowa Republican voters thought that this New Yorker, this New York businessman, was Jewish, then he might have a big problem in Iowa. And so he's the only presidential candidate in history who took pains to point out that he's not Jewish. And of course, it was Donald Trump who had one of the accountants at one of his casinos fired because Donald Trump believed that that accountant was not Jewish. Donald Trump said then, quote, the only kind of people I want counting my money are short guys that wear yarmulkes every day. We know Donald Trump is unperturbed by anti-Semitism enough that he is the only president in history who has happily dined with a Holocaust denier and never apologized for that. Donald Trump had an intimate dinner at home in Florida with a Holocaust denier. And now Donald Trump wants to tell us and everyone else how to stop anti-Semitism. How about don't have dinner with Holocaust deniers? How about that? Donald Trump is the single worst investigator of anti-Semitism who has ever claimed to be investigating anti-Semitism. Donald Trump currently employs an acting U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., who he has nominated for Senate confirmation to become the U.S. attorney for Washington, D.C., who himself has happily praised a man who said, quote, Hitler should have finished the job. At the sentencing hearing of a January 6 defendant named Timothy Hale, federal prosecutors introduced evidence that he had said Hitler should have finished the job. And Ed Martin, who is now the head of the office, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., the acting head that prosecuted all of the January 6 defendants, heaped praise on the man who said Hitler should have finished the job.
One guy is named Timothy Hale. Tim served 3+ years in prison based almost entirely on the 1512 fraudulent charge. In prison, he did the things that he'd done in his life before, which is he thought a lot and read a lot and been a writer and a thinker. He's the nephew of our own Cynthia Hughes, who's done so much for so many of us. But he's an extraordinary man, extraordinary leader now of those who have survived January 6th. And I think he's resisted this, but I don't care because I have I bought this microphone, and I want him to come up and say at least a few minutes of thoughts, and have you encourage him with a round of applause. Timothy Hale. Tim.
With Donald Trump hauntingly and symbolically looking on in that portrait there beside the microphone, Donald Trump's choice to be the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., invites, demands applause from the audience for the man who said Hitler should have finished the job. That's Donald Trump's team in action. Hitler should have finished the job. That man gets the full approval of the acting Trump U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., Ed Martin. And Donald Trump claims to be the chief investigator and preventer of anti-Semitism in America. Ed Martin knows Timothy Hale's case. He quoted Timothy Hale's case. He knows it. He must know. How could he not know that the federal prosecutors presented evidence that Timothy Hale said Hitler should have finished the job? Donald Trump's choice to be the U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C. praised the man who he had to know had said Hitler should have finished the job. That was part of the sentencing hearing in a sentence that Ed Martin thinks was unfair. Federal prosecutors presented that to the judge in that case, a case that Ed Martin claims to be an expert about. He's an expert about a case where the prosecutors said that the man Ed Martin thinks is a hero and should be praised by him and by the onlooking Trump portrait, that man who said Hitler should have finished the job. Ed Martin brought his legal expertise to that case of the man who said Hitler should have finished the job, and has decided that he was wrongfully convicted by that oppressive Justice Department that prosecuted all of those innocent people who were on their way on January 6th to try to kill the Vice President of the United States, among other violent ambitions they had that day, and screamed that day at the top of their lungs. Donald Trump's anti-Semitism police didn't find that guy. But Donald Trump's anti-Semitism police said that Donald Trump has to take over Harvard University because Harvard University has no idea how to deal with anti-Semitism the way Donald Trump does. Donald Trump wants Harvard University to fire anyone who condones anti-Semitism or expel any student who condones anti-Semitism. And Donald Trump employs and is trying to obtain Senate confirmation for a man who praised a convicted criminal who said Hitler should have finished the job. All of that information was available to Donald Trump before he chose Ed Martin to be his U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. All of it. And Donald Trump, the great anti-Semitism investigator, doesn't care about it. Donald Trump has not fired Ed Martin for praising that anti-Semite who you're looking at on your screen right now. That is the man who prosecutors has said Hitler should have finished the job, and that is the man who Donald Trump's acting U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., was just praising on that video that you just saw. Ed Martin is now one of the fully disgraced attorneys who has been appointed by Donald Trump to the Justice Department, where some of them spend their days now trying to defend the mistake Donald Trump's gang deportation team made by deporting Kilmer Abrego Garcia, who was in this country since he was 16 years old, has never been convicted of any crime in any country. Early in the proceedings, one Justice Department lawyer involved in the case admitted to the judge that it was what he called an administrative error to deport Mr. Abrego Garcia. And because that lawyer admitted that lawyer has now been fired from the Trump Justice Department. Since that lawyer was removed from the case, Judge Paul Azinas has been more than frustrated trying to get the Trump lawyers in the Trump Justice Department to do the minimally decent thing and the constitutional thing and correct their mistake and bring Mr. Abrego Garcia back to the United States from the proudly cruel prison in El Salvador, where most of the people sent there by Donald Trump have absolutely no evidence of any gang affiliations of any kind and no criminal records anywhere. In a hearing today, Judge Zenas said, to date, what the record shows is nothing has been done. Nothing. Meaning the Trump Justice Department has ignored her demands, supported by the Supreme Court, that they facilitate Mr. Abrego Garcia's return to the United States. Today, the judge said something to the Trump Justice Department lawyers that most federal judges have never had to say to any lawyers. Quote, there will be no tolerance for gamesmanship or grandstanding. The judge said that yesterday's discussion in the Oval Office about the case between Donald Trump and the president of El Salvador, who proudly proclaims himself to be a dictator, had no relevance to the proceedings in the case. She said that scene in the Oval Office was, quote, two very misguided ships passing in the night. Just before today's hearing started, the Trump lawyers added this statement to the record of the case, quote, if Abrego Garcia does present at a port of entry, he would become subject to detention by Department of Homeland Security. In that case, Department of Homeland Security would take him into custody in the United States and either remove him to a third country or terminate his withholding of removal because of his membership in MS-13, a designated foreign terrorist organization, and remove him to El Salvador. So the Trump lawyers are now saying there is no point in trying to bring him back, because if he's brought back, we will immediately send him back to El Salvador because he is a member of MS-13, even though there isn't the slightest bit of evidence that he's a member of any gang. Judge Zenas has noted that the evidence about this gang stuff, quote, consisted of nothing more than his Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie and a vague, uncorroborated allegation from a confidential informant claiming he belonged to MS-13's Western clique in New York, a place he has never lived. And once again today, Donald Trump made this case, the Abrego Garcia case, a case about all of us, about you, about me, about every American citizen, about every person in this country. Donald Trump is now saying that he eagerly wants to deport American citizens to El Salvador. And when he says that, he does not mention that those citizens must be formally convicted of a crime before he deports them. But let's just assume that he does want to send American citizens to a prison in El Salvador only after they've been convicted of a crime. That simply means if he snatched an American citizen off the street and sent that American to El Salvador, to a prison in El Salvador, without that citizen having been convicted of a crime, that would be what the Trump lawyers call an administrative error. And Donald Trump and his lawyers are saying in court that the administrative error can never be fixed, because once they've sent someone to that El Salvador prison, there is nothing they can do to get that person out of that El Salvador prison, even though
নারাকি মাটিতে নারাকি পাটিতে নারাকি পালকের ঘরে নারাকি মাটিতে নারাকি পাটিতে নারাকি পালকের ঘরে শীতির সুন্দরে রাখিব বন্ধুরে শীতির সিন্ধুরে রাখিব বন্ধুরে কাজল পরাণের বন্ধুরে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে কি জানাতে গান শুনি বন্ধু পরবাসী পরে ঘরে আসি এত ঘুমে কেন ধরে বন্ধু পরবাসী পরে ঘরে আসি এত ঘুমে কেন ধরে কয়লা ঘরে ধনী পোহাইল রজনী কয়লা ঘরে ধনী পোহাইল রজনী নারাকিলে মনির ঘরে নারাকিল মনির ঘরে কি জ্বালা দিয়া গেলাম রে নয়নের কাজল পরাণের বন্ধুরে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে কি জানি লেখটা নারী প্রেম গেছে কিন্তু না কইরাছে বস্ত্র কষি কষি পরে নারী প্রেম গেছে কিন্তু না কইরাছে বস্ত্র কষি কষি পরে কহে আসকো হরালি সাধু শত জানি কহে আশ্র হরালি কহে আসকো হরালি সাধু শত জানি উদাসী বানাইল মোরে উদাসী বানাইল মোরে কি জ্বালা দিয়া গেলা মোরে নয়নের কাজল পরাণের বন্ধুরে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে না দেখিলে পরাণ করে দিয়া গেলাম মোরে নয়নের কাজল পরাণ lo americano.